Hello there. Welcome to our little corner of whispered historical tales, where those dusty old pages are no longer the burden of knowledge, but gentle melodies that softly carry you into dreams. If you're here, perhaps you're like me, someone who loves the old things, the forgotten stories, but also needs a bit of peace to let your mind unwind. Tonight, we'll turn together through pages of what might seem rather mundane history about the imperial examination systems of ancient China. Doesn't sound particularly captivating for a peaceful night's rest, does it? But sometimes the most seemingly dry subjects hide the most surprisingly fascinating details. Rules so strict they border on the absurd, enough to keep your mind wandering pleasantly, then slowly, settling into stillness. Just let yourself relax. Close your eyes if you'd like. There's no need to try to remember anything at all. Simply listen and let these stories carry you away. Picture this, if you will, a quiet late night in some ancient capital city of China. Pale moonlight spilling across those distinctive curved roof tiles. And somewhere, in those small rooms, the flickering light of oil lamps still illuminates hunched figures, bent over their books. Who are they? They are scholars. Young men betting their entire futures, their family honor, their very destinies on a single examination. An examination that could change everything. Sounds a bit like our modern college entrance exams, doesn't it? But my friend, what they faced was so much more. It wasn't just about knowledge, but about an entire system of rules, regulations so rigid that, well, you might find them somewhat amusing, or at least hard to believe when compared to today. We won't be talking about glorious battles tonight, or thrilling palace intrigues. No. This evening, we'll find ourselves in the quiet corners, the everyday details of one of the most important and, perhaps, stressful institutions in Chinese history. Imagine, for a moment, spending your entire youth preparing for a test. Not just any test, but one where you might spend days locked in a tiny cell-like room, where the wrong word could destroy your future, where even your handwriting had to follow exact specifications, where thousands of young men would travel for months, carrying their beds on their backs, just for the chance to prove themselves worthy. These weren't just exams. They were elaborate rituals, almost like entering a different world entirely, a world with its own language, its own customs, and its own peculiar, shall we say, inconveniences that make our modern testing anxieties seem rather quaint by comparison. Tonight, we'll explore whether these boring regulations were truly boring, or whether they hide something that might make you smile softly in your drowsiness. So why were these examinations so monumentally important? Well, in a society that valued learning and hierarchy above almost all else, the imperial examinations were practically the only path for an ordinary person to rise up, to change their station in life. A certificate, a government position that represented an entire dream. And because of this immense importance, people created countless rules. Rules designed to ensure fairness, at least in theory. But also creating situations so absurdly stressful, so bizarrely detailed, that we modern folk might struggle to even imagine them. Picture this. You're a young scholar, maybe 18 or 20 years old. You've spent years, perhaps a decade, memorizing thousands of classical texts. Not just memorizing, mind you, but understanding every nuance, every possible interpretation. Your family has scraped together their meager savings to support your studies. Your village looks upon you as their bright hope. The pressure, well, the pressure is rather extraordinary. But the pressure was just the beginning. Before you could even think about demonstrating your scholarly brilliance, you had to prove you were even eligible to take the exam. Your family background was scrutinized. Were your ancestors involved in disreputable professions? Acting, perhaps. Music, certain types of manual labor. Even if your great-grandfather had been involved in what society deemed unseemly work, you might be barred from participation. Strange, isn't it? But there it was, a barrier before the barrier. Then came the paperwork. Oh, the paperwork. Certificates from your village, recommendations from your teachers. Most importantly, you needed someone of standing to vouch for you. Someone willing to stake their own reputation on your character. If your guarantor fell into disgrace, well, you might find yourself unexpectedly eliminated from consideration. If you managed to clear these preliminary hurdles, then began the real journey. And I do mean journey. Many scholars had to travel for weeks, even months, on foot, or perhaps with a struggling donkey, crossing mountains and rivers, through forests where bandits might rob you of your few precious possessions, including those invaluable books that represented years of your life. The physical dangers were real. Illness from bad water, exhaustion from walking endless miles, and yes, actual robbers who knew that scholars, despite appearing poor, often carried enough money for the journey, and sometimes valuable texts that could be sold. Some young men never made it to the examination halls at all. They fell along the way, their dreams left unfinished on some remote mountain path. And the cost? My goodness, the cost. Every mile meant money for food, for shelter. You needed to buy paper, ink, brushes for the exam. Sometimes, to make things go more smoothly at various checkpoints, one had to be understanding about certain small additional fees. A modest family fortune could disappear into a single exam attempt. But perhaps most charmingly inconvenient was the requirement to carry your own bed. Or rather, your own Lu Chong, a portable sleeping arrangement consisting of a bamboo frame and a thin cloth cover. This was your entire home during the journey and the examination period. Imagine walking hundreds of miles carrying not just books and supplies, but essentially a piece of furniture on your back. And we complain about having to bring our own pencils to tests. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite all these obstacles, despite the physical hardships, the financial strain, the bureaucratic maze, thousands upon thousands of young men undertook this journey. Some would attempt it multiple times over decades. The dream of transformation, of bringing honor to their families, of serving their country. It was powerful enough to overcome seemingly impossible barriers. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself thinking about that kind of determination, that willingness to endure so much for a dream. It's rather inspiring, isn't it? Even if the rules they had to follow were sometimes absolutely, well, let's just say they might make you appreciate the relative simplicity of modern testing just a little bit more. Now then, take a deep breath in, let it out slowly, and let me tell you about what happened when these determined young scholars finally reached the examination halls. Soon. Chapter 1. The Thorny Path to the examination halls. Let's place ourselves in the position of a young scholar, full of dreams of serving the empire and bringing honor to his family. But before you could even dream of carrying your makeshift bed to the examination halls, you had to ask yourself some rather particular questions. Was your family clean? Had your ancestors engaged in occupations that society looked down upon? This wasn't just about criminal activity, mind you. If your grandfather had been an actor, a musician, or even worked in what were considered lowly trades like leather tanning or butchering, well, that could be a problem. It sounds odd to our modern ears, doesn't it? But there it was, one of the first barriers. Your family tree had to be scrubbed clean of anything society deemed unseemly. Even if you were brilliant, even if you'd memorized every classical text ever written, if your great-grandfather had played music for a living, you might find the examination doors firmly closed to you. Then came the paperwork. Oh, the delightful bureaucracy. You needed certificates proving your identity, your residency, your moral character. Letters from village officials confirming you were who you claimed to be. Recommendations from your teachers stating not just that you were learned, but that you were worthy of the privilege of attempting the examinations. Most crucially, you needed a guarantor, someone of respected standing, willing to put their own reputation on the line for you. This person was essentially betting their social credit that you wouldn't embarrass yourself or, worse, engage in any misconduct. If your guarantor later fell into disgrace, well, you might find yourself mysteriously eliminated from consideration, no matter how qualified you were. The fascinating thing was that this guarantor system was designed to ensure only proper candidates participated, but it also meant that sometimes the most talented scholars from humble backgrounds never got their chance, simply because they didn't know anyone important enough to vouch for them. Social connections mattered as much as scholarly ability, not so different from certain aspects of our world today, perhaps. Some of the restrictions were quite specific and, well, charmingly arbitrary. In certain periods, the descendants of those who worked with leather, or barbers, or even fortune tellers were prohibited. There were detailed lists of unacceptable family professions, passed down through generations like a strange form of social DNA testing. Imagine having to trace your family tree not to find noble ancestors, but to prove you didn't have any musicians or actors hiding in the branches. If you were fortunate enough to qualify, then the real adventure began. And I do mean adventure, though perhaps not the pleasant kind you might choose for a vacation. Picture this: no buses, no trains, no highways, just your feet. Or if you were somewhat better off, perhaps a donkey or a rickety cart pulled by an ox. You might need to walk for weeks, even months, crossing mountain passes where the paths were little more than scratches on the cliff sides, fording rivers with no bridges, navigating through forests where, well, where other people with less scholarly intentions might be waiting. The distances were truly staggering. Scholars from the far provinces might travel over 1,000 miles. Imagine walking from New York to Florida, carrying everything you owned on your back, with no guarantee you'd even be allowed to take the test once you arrived. The journey itself could take months, and every day meant spending precious money on food and shelter. The roads. Calling them roads is perhaps generous. Muddy tracks in the rainy season, Dusty paths under the blazing sun, treacherous ice in winter. Your feet would blister, then callous, then blister again. Your shoulders would ache from carrying your belongings. And always, always, the nagging worry that you might arrive too late or too exhausted to perform well. Then there were the dangers that had nothing to do with geography. Bandits knew that scholars, despite their modest appearance, often carried their life savings for the journey, plus those precious books that could be sold for good money. There are accounts of young men who simply vanished on their way to the examinations, their dreams ending not in a test hall, but on some lonely mountain path. The smell of fear and determination must have hung over those ancient highways, mixed with dust, sweat, and the particular scent of old books carried too long in damp weather. Can you imagine it? That mixture of hope and terror, mile after endless mile. The expenses mounted relentlessly. Food, lodging, replacement supplies when something broke or was stolen. You needed extra paper, ink sticks, brushes, and sometimes, to ensure things went smoothly at various checkpoints, a little extra something for the guards or officials. A family's modest savings could evaporate entirely on a single examination attempt. Weather was another constant enemy. Scholars caught in unexpected storms might lose irreplaceable notes to the rain. Those traveling in winter risked frostbite, while summer travelers faced heat exhaustion and contaminated water that could leave them too sick to continue. And yet they kept walking. Some would make this journey multiple times over their lifetimes, each attempt representing renewed hope, renewed sacrifice, the determination required. It's rather extraordinary when you think about it, all for the chance to sit in a tiny room and write essays about ancient philosophy. Now let's talk about your traveling companion, your Lu Chang. This sounds poetic, doesn't it? Lu Chang. It has a certain musical quality, but the reality was, well, let's just say poetry and comfort don't always go hand in hand. The Chang was essentially a bamboo bed frame, just large enough for one person to lie down, assuming that person didn't mind sleeping curled up like a cat. The Lu was a thin cloth covering, providing what we might generously call weather protection. Together, they formed your mobile home for the entire journey and examination period. Picture yourself as a walking furniture store. You're carrying not just your books, clothes, food, and examination supplies, but also your bed. This contraption, when assembled, was about as comfortable as, well, as sleeping on a bamboo frame with a thin cloth over it. When disassembled for travel, it was heavy, awkward, and had an annoying tendency to poke you in the ribs with every step. The weight was just the beginning of its charms. This mobile bedroom was also your kitchen, study, and, shall we say, private facilities during the journey. Privacy, of course, being a relative concept when your room was made of thin fabric that fluttered in every breeze. Setting up camp each evening was an art form. First, you had to find relatively level ground that wasn't too rocky, too muddy, or too populated with insects. Then came the delicate process of assembling your frame without losing any pieces in the gathering darkness. The cloth covering had to be stretched just so. Too loose, and rain would pool in the middle. Too tight, and the whole contraption might collapse in the middle of the night. Meals were creative affairs. You carried a small pot, perhaps a few basic utensils. Dinner might consist of rice gruel, with whatever vegetables you could find growing wild by the roadside, or dried meat if you could afford such luxury. All of this prepared over a tiny fire, if fire was possible, or eaten cold if it wasn't. And then there was the matter of personal hygiene. Bathing was a rare luxury, usually consisting of a quick splash in whatever stream or pond you encountered. Clean clothes were whatever you could rinse out and hope would dry by morning. Dental care was, well, let's just say fresh breath wasn't a priority when you were focused on not starving or being robbed. The sleeping arrangements deserve special mention. Your bamboo frame was designed for efficiency, not comfort. Every bump in the ground became intimately familiar to your bones. The covering provided minimal protection from cold, wind, or moisture. Rain turned your mobile bedroom into a very personal swimming pool. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the complete lack of privacy. When you stopped for the night, you were often in the company of other travelers, merchants, pilgrims, other scholars. Your room was visible to anyone who cared to look, your conversations audible to all. Personal moments. Well, they weren't particularly personal. Winter travel was especially charming. Your thin covering became a sail for every freezing wind. Ice would form on the inside of the fabric by morning. Sometimes scholars would wake to find themselves lightly dusted with snow, their breath visible in the air inside their shelter. And yet, this humble Lu Chong represented hope. It was your ticket to the examination, your proof that you were serious about your scholarly pursuits. Some families would save for years to buy the materials for one, viewing it as an investment in their son's future. In its own way, it was almost touching. Finally, after weeks or months of travel, you would arrive at the imperial capital. But rather than relief, what awaited was, well, let's call it an intensely social experience. Thousands upon thousands of scholars converged on the examination sites, creating what could only be described as a temporary city of desperate hope. Picture Times Square on New Year's Eve. But instead of celebration, everyone is clutching books and trying to control their anxiety. The days before the examination began were a peculiar blend of cramming, networking, and barely controlled panic. You'd see scholars huddled in groups, testing each other on obscure classical references. Others sat alone, rocking back and forth as they muttered memorized passages. Some tried to gather information about the examination officials. What were their scholarly preferences? What topics might they favor? The rumors flew like autumn leaves. Someone heard that this year's questions would focus on the Book of Changes. Another insisted that contemporary political commentary would be crucial. A third swore that calligraphy would count more heavily than content. Truth and speculation became hopelessly tangled in the anxious chatter. And then there was the matter of, let's call it, atmospheric density. When you gather thousands of people in one place for several days, with limited facilities for personal hygiene, the air takes on certain distinctive qualities. Medieval cities weren't exactly known for their sanitation systems, and temporary scholar encampments were no exception. The aroma was complex. Layers of human perspiration accumulated over weeks of travel, mixed with the smell of cooking food, most of it not particularly fresh. Add to this the scent of oil lamps burning constantly, since many scholars studied through the night, and the general mustiness of thousands of old books that had been carried through all weather. And of course, with no modern plumbing, certain necessary human functions contributed their own notes to this aromatic symphony. But perhaps most pungent was the smell of fear. Yes, fear has a smell, that sharp, acidic scent of stress-induced sweat, the metallic tang of adrenaline, the sour note of stomachs twisted with anxiety. It hung over the scholar encampments like fog, thick and unmistakable. Yet within this chaos, there was also something beautiful. These young men, despite their fear, despite the overwhelming competition, often helped each other. They shared food when someone ran short, offered medicine when someone fell ill, provided comfort when homesickness became too intense. Friendship bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. The evenings were particularly poignant. As darkness fell, thousands of tiny lights would appear. Oil lamps, candles, even torches for those who couldn't afford better. From a distance, the scholar encampment must have looked like a field of stars, each point of light representing someone's dreams, someone's hopes for a better future. The conversations you'd overhear, young men sharing their fears about their family's expectations, their worries about the cost of failure, their dreams of the honors that success might bring. Some spoke of elderly parents who had sacrificed everything for their education. Others talked about younger siblings whose futures depended on this one opportunity. As the examination day approached, the tension became almost tangible. Scholars would check and recheck their supplies, ink sticks, brushes, paper, the small amount of food they were allowed to bring. They'd rehearse their handwriting, practice their essay structures, review their memorized texts one final time. The night before the examination, sleep was elusive for most. How could you rest when everything you'd worked for your entire life depended on the next few days? Some spent the night in prayer, others in final frantic study. A few wise souls tried to rest, knowing they'd need all their mental clarity for the challenges ahead. And then dawn would come, the sound of the examination drum echoing across the encampment, calling thousands of hopeful young scholars to their fate. The real test was about to begin. But first, they would have to pass through gates more carefully guarded than any palace. Tomorrow, we'll follow them through those gates, into a world of rules so detailed, so precise, that they make our modern testing procedures seem almost casual by comparison. But for now, just imagine those thousands of young men, hearts pounding, gathering their courage for the most important few days of their lives. Third, Chapter 2. Inside the examination halls. A world apart. Dawn breaks, and the examination drum echoes across the compound. This is when you must line up, waiting your turn to enter. This was no casual stroll into a classroom. The guards would examine you with the thoroughness of, well, imagine airport security, but conducted by people who had never heard of personal privacy and who considered suspicion a professional virtue. Every inch of your body became subject to inspection. Your clothing was examined seam by seam, pockets turned inside out, shoes removed and shaken, socks peeled off and checked. But it didn't stop there. Your hair, yes, your hair would be carefully combed through, strand by strand, checking for tiny pieces of paper that might contain helpful notes. Some examination halls required scholars to undo their top knots completely, letting their hair fall loose so guards could run their fingers through it like customs agents searching for contraband. The clothing regulations were particularly specific. You were often required to wear only a single layer, no thick robes that might conceal notes, no multiple garments with hidden pockets. Some periods mandated special examination clothes, essentially simple tunics with no pockets at all, provided by the examination authorities themselves. Imagine stripping down to basic government-issued clothing just to take a test. The items you could bring were limited to absolute essentials: writing brushes, ink sticks, an inkstone for grinding, and blank paper, though even the paper was often provided and counted to prevent any sneaky notes written in invisible ink or tiny characters. You were allowed food and water for several days, usually simple fare like dried rice, pickled vegetables, perhaps some dried meat if you could afford it. And then there was the chamber pot. Yes, a small personal toilet, because once you entered your examination cell, you wouldn't be leaving for any reason. This particular detail often surprises modern folks. The idea that bathroom breaks could compromise the integrity of an examination. But there it was, one of your essential examination supplies. The guards had seen every conceivable attempt at cheating. Notes written on the inside of clothing, text carved into the wooden handles of brushes, even tiny papers rolled up and hidden inside the hollow cores of writing instruments. There are accounts of incredibly creative hiding places, inside the layers of shoes, sewn into the seams of undergarments, even written on the inside of examination baskets in special inks that became visible only when heated. The level of innovation in academic dishonesty was, well, rather impressive actually. Students would write entire essays in characters so microscopic they required magnifying glasses to read, then hide these papers in places the human body could conceal. Some would memorize the exact positions of notes hidden throughout their clothing, creating a kind of wearable cheat sheet. But the examination officials were equally creative in their countermeasures. Special wooden sticks for poking through hair buns, mirrors for checking the insides of shoes, even requirements that scholars bend over so gravity could reveal any hidden papers. The whole process could take hours, with thousands of nervous young men shuffling forward in line, watching their dreams potentially crumble over a forgotten scrap of paper. The psychological effect was intentional. By the time you reached your examination cell, you'd been thoroughly humbled, reminded that you were entering a sacred space where normal rules didn't apply. You were no longer a person with rights and dignity. You were a test taker, subject to rules that governed every aspect of your existence for the next several days. After passing through this gauntlet of inspection, you would be led to your examination room. Now, please don't imagine a spacious classroom with comfortable desks and good lighting. No. What awaited you was something more like, well, a very small closet. These examination cells were arranged in long rows, numbered sequentially, each one just large enough for, well, for one person to exist barely. We're talking about a space perhaps 6 feet by 4 feet, just enough room for your bamboo sleeping frame, a tiny writing surface, and that essential chamber pot. The walls were usually simple wood or brick, maybe 7 feet high, creating hundreds of identical little boxes, each containing one nervous scholar. The conditions were, let's call them character building. No climate control, obviously. If it was summer, your little cell became an oven. The walls absorbed heat during the day, and radiated it back at you all night. If it was winter, you might find frost forming on the inside walls, and your ink could literally freeze solid, making writing impossible until you warmed it with your breath or body heat. Lighting was entirely your responsibility. You brought your own candles or oil lamps, and you'd better hope they lasted the entire examination period. Running out of light during a night writing session wasn't just inconvenient. It could mean failing the exam entirely. Some scholars brought multiple backup light sources, treating them like precious resources, which they absolutely were. The writing surface was minimalist, usually just a small board or section of desk built into the cell wall. No ergonomic considerations, no adjustable height. You wrote hunched over, often sitting on your bamboo frame, trying to keep your paper from blowing away, and whatever breeze might sneak through the gaps in the walls. And then there was the matter of complete isolation. For 3 days, sometimes longer, you could not speak to another human being. You couldn't see what others were writing. You couldn't ask questions, couldn't request clarification, couldn't even acknowledge the existence of the scholars in the cells next to you, despite being close enough to hear them breathing. The silence was profound. Imagine thousands of people, all in one compound, all writing furiously. But the only sounds were the scratching of brushes on paper, the occasional cough, and the soft sounds of people shifting on their bamboo frames. No conversation, no collaboration, no human contact whatsoever. Some scholars found this isolation maddening, being alone with your thoughts for days, under enormous pressure, with your entire future hanging in the balance. It's not surprising that some had what we might now call nervous breakdowns. Guards were trained to recognize the signs of scholars who were becoming unwell and to remove them quietly before they disturbed others. The weather could make everything worse. If it rained, your cell might leak. Depending on the construction and your luck, you might find yourself writing in puddles, trying to keep your papers dry while water dripped from the ceiling. Some examination compounds had partial roofs. Others left scholars completely exposed to the elements. Wind was another challenge. Papers could blow away, candles could be extinguished, and your thin roof covering, if you had one, could flap and snap all night, making sleep nearly impossible. And sleep was crucial, because examinations often lasted multiple days, requiring both mental endurance and physical stamina. Food became a strategic consideration. What you brought had to last for days without refrigeration, in whatever weather conditions you encountered. It had to be nutritious enough to keep your mind sharp, but simple enough to prepare in your tiny space with minimal equipment. Many scholars lived on little more than rice gruel and dried vegetables for the entire examination period. Privacy, as you might imagine, was non-existent. Everything you did, eating, sleeping, writing, and yes, using that chamber pot, was potentially visible or audible to guards making their rounds. Personal dignity became a luxury you simply couldn't afford. The examination was designed to strip away everything except your knowledge and your ability to express it in writing. Now, let's discuss the rules. Oh, the rules. If you think modern standardized tests are strict, well, you're about to gain a new appreciation for the relative freedom you enjoy. The most obvious prohibitions were about cheating, of course. No reference materials, no copying from others, no communication with fellow scholars. But the rules went so much deeper than that. They governed how you sat, how you wrote, even how you arranged your papers on your tiny writing surface. The penalties for rule violations were substantial. If caught with any unauthorized material, you faced immediate disqualification. Your papers would be torn up before your eyes. Your name would be recorded as a cheater, and you might be barred from taking examinations for years, possibly forever. Some repeat offenders faced physical punishment, beatings, public humiliation, even imprisonment. But it wasn't just about cheating. The examination officials were obsessed with, let's call it, presentation standards. Your handwriting had to meet specific criteria. Characters had to be formed in the proper stroke order, with the correct proportions, and in the traditional style. Sloppy calligraphy could result in automatic failure, regardless of the brilliance of your ideas. The layout of your essays was regulated down to the smallest detail. Margins had to be exact. Line spacing had to be consistent. Some examinations specified the number of characters per line, the number of lines per page, even the size of individual characters. Deviation from these standards wasn't just marked down. It could invalidate your entire submission. You couldn't cross out mistakes. If you wrote an incorrect character, your only option was to draw a single, gentle line through it and continue. Too many corrections made your paper look messy and unprofessional. Some scholars would restart entire essays rather than submit work with visible corrections. The rules about timing were equally inflexible. When the examination began, you began writing. When time was called, you stopped immediately, mid-character if necessary. Being caught writing even a single stroke after the signal could result in disqualification. Guards patrolled constantly, watching for any violations of timing rules. Movement within your cell was restricted. You couldn't stand and stretch. Couldn't pace to clear your mind. Couldn't even rearrange your materials without potentially attracting suspicion. Sitting in the same position for hours, then days, writing continuously. It was physically demanding in ways that had nothing to do with intellectual ability. The psychological pressure was enormous. You knew that any mistake, any rule violation, any moment of poor judgment could destroy years of preparation. Some scholars became so paralyzed by the fear of breaking a rule that they couldn't write effectively. Others became so focused on following regulations that they lost sight of actually answering the examination questions. Food and drink consumption was regulated. You could eat your provisions, but you had to do so quietly, without disturbing others. Some examinations prohibited certain foods that might create strong odors or sounds. Even drinking water had to be done carefully. Spilling liquid on your papers could ruin hours of work. Personal hygiene. Well, that was regulated too. You couldn't leave your cell to wash, couldn't change clothes, couldn't groom yourself beyond the most basic necessities. By the end of a multi-day examination, the collective aroma of thousands of scholars was quite noticeable. Guards were sometimes provided with scented cloths to help them endure their patrol duties. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging rule was the prohibition against violating name taboos, writing or speaking the personal names of emperors, imperial family members, or revered sages. This sounds simple enough until you realize that Chinese characters appear in countless combinations, and the chances of accidentally writing a forbidden name were, well, higher than you might think. Every reigning emperor had a personal name that became instantly taboo. Previous emperors' names remained forbidden. Add to this the names of imperial relatives, legendary sages, and local officials, and you had a minefield of prohibited characters. The consequences of violating name taboos were severe. At minimum, automatic failure. But depending on the circumstances and the name involved, you could face charges of disrespect toward the imperial family, a crime that could result in exile, imprisonment, or worse. Some scholars were executed for what appeared to be innocent mistakes in their examination papers. To avoid these violations, scholars had to memorize extensive lists of forbidden names and develop strategies for circumventing them. They might use synonyms, deliberately misspell characters by omitting strokes, or restructure entire sentences to avoid problematic combinations. Imagine trying to write a complex philosophical essay while simultaneously playing an elaborate word avoidance game. The mental gymnastics required were extraordinary. You had to keep track of current taboos, historical taboos, regional variations, and even potential taboos, names that might become forbidden if political circumstances changed during your examination period. Some scholars kept mental lists of hundreds of prohibited character combinations. The stroke omission method was particularly artistic. If you needed to write a character that contained forbidden elements, you would deliberately leave out one or more strokes, creating a character that looked almost correct but technically avoided the taboo. Readers were expected to understand that the missing strokes represented respectful avoidance rather than ignorance. But even this workaround had rules. You had to omit the right strokes in the right way. Omitting too many strokes made the character unreadable. Omitting the wrong strokes might accidentally create a different forbidden character. Some scholars practiced taboo avoidance calligraphy for years, developing an almost artistic skill in creative character modification. The psychological pressure of taboo avoidance was immense. Every character you wrote required split-second analysis. Is this safe? Does this combination create a forbidden name? Have the taboos changed since I last studied them? Some scholars became so anxious about accidental violations that they developed a kind of writer's block, unable to proceed for fear of making a fatal mistake. Then there were the other forbidden elements. Red ink was reserved for imperial use and examination graders. Using red ink as a scholar was presumptuous at best, treasonous at worst. Your ink had to be pure black, properly mixed, and applied with appropriate humility. Paper quality mattered too. Your examination papers had to remain pristine throughout the process. Water stains, ink blots, tears, or excessive wear could invalidate your work. Some scholars brought extra papers, but these had to be officially provided and counted. Bringing your own paper from outside was prohibited. It might contain hidden notes or markings. Even emotional expression was regulated. Crying on your papers, which happened more often than you might think, given the stress, could smudge your writing and ruin your work. Some scholars learned to cry silently, letting tears fall away from their papers, or to use their sleeves to carefully dab away moisture without disturbing their writing. The cumulative effect of all these rules was to create an environment where academic achievement was secondary to rule compliance. The most brilliant scholar in the empire could fail for a single procedural error, while a mediocre student who followed every regulation perfectly might succeed. It was a system that tested not just knowledge, but psychological endurance, attention to detail, and the ability to perform under extreme pressure. 3 days, or sometimes longer, passed in this strange world of absolute rules and total isolation. When the final signal came, when the last brush stroke was completed, scholars emerged from their cells like people who had been living in tiny boxes for days, which is exactly what they were. But their ordeal wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, the hardest part was just beginning. Because now came the waiting, the uncertainty, and the complex journey their carefully written papers would take through the bureaucratic maze of Imperial evaluation. Tomorrow, we'll follow those papers on their own adventure, through the hands of scribes and judges, through processes designed to ensure fairness, but sometimes achieving the opposite. But for now, let's just imagine those thousands of exhausted scholars stepping out of their cells into daylight, wondering if their dreams had just come true, or if they'd have to do it all again next time. IV, Chapter 3. After the lamps go out, the fate of papers and scholars. When the final drum sounds, echoing across the examination compound to signal the end of writing time, you must stop your brush immediately. The examination officials will then collect your papers, sealing each set with the same careful attention they might give to state secrets. Picture this moment. After days of intense concentration, your hand cramped from holding a brush, your eyes strained from squinting at characters by candlelight, you must watch as officials methodically gather up everything you've poured your heart into. They handle each paper with bureaucratic precision, checking that every sheet is present, that nothing has been torn or damaged. But here's where things become interesting. To ensure absolute fairness, your examination papers undergo a process called separating the identification tags. Your name, hometown, family background. All of this personal information is written on a separate section of your examination booklet. This section is then carefully cut away and sealed separately, leaving your actual essays identified only by a number. The theory was beautiful, really. When the graders read your work, they would have no idea whether they were reading the essays of a governor's son or a farmer's child, whether the writer came from a wealthy province or a poor village. Only your words, your ideas, your mastery of classical texts would matter. It was, at least in concept, remarkably egalitarian for its time. Of course, where there are systems designed to prevent favoritism, there are often creative individuals who find ways to work around those systems. But we'll save those stories for a bit later. The sealing process itself was elaborate. Officials would use special wax, official stamps, multiple layers of paper wrapping. Your examination papers became little packages, like gifts that no one was allowed to open until the proper time. Each package was marked with codes, numbers, symbols that allowed tracking without revealing identity. The room where this sealing took place must have been quite a sight. Dozens of officials working methodically, surrounded by thousands of paper bundles, the air thick with the smell of sealing wax and the soft sounds of bureaucratic efficiency. There was something almost ceremonial about it. The transformation of personal hopes into anonymous documents. But even this careful process had its vulnerabilities. Papers could be damaged during handling. Seals could be broken accidentally. Sometimes the identification tags were separated incorrectly, creating examination papers that could never be matched back to their authors. Imagine spending years preparing for an examination, writing brilliant essays, only to have your work lost in a bureaucratic mix-up. The officials responsible for this process carried enormous weight on their shoulders. A single mistake could affect not just one scholar's future, but the reputation of the entire examination system. Some officials developed elaborate double-checking procedures, triple sealing protocols, systems of verification that made the process incredibly slow, but, hopefully, more reliable. And yet, despite all these precautions, scholars still worried. Had their papers been sealed properly? Would the identification tags be correctly reattached when results were announced? Was there any chance their carefully crafted essays might simply disappear into the bureaucratic maze? The anonymization process was supposed to eliminate bias, but it created its own forms of anxiety. At least when corruption was obvious, scholars knew what they were dealing with. This new system promised fairness, but delivered uncertainty, which, in some ways, was almost harder to bear. Your examination papers, now safely anonymous, faced another journey before reaching the people who would determine your fate. They would be copied, entirely rewritten by hand, before any grader saw them. You see, even anonymous papers could reveal their authors' identities through handwriting. A grader might recognize the distinctive brushstrokes of a former student, a relative, or someone whose writing they'd seen before. So the examination system created an entire profession of copyists, scribes, whose job was to transcribe every character of every essay in standardized handwriting. Picture this: rooms full of copyists, working in shifts, transcribing thousands of examination papers. Each copyist had to reproduce not just the content of essays, but their exact structure, their spacing, even their mistakes. If you had written a character incorrectly, the copyist reproduced your error precisely. If your essay was brilliant, they copied it faithfully. If it was terrible, well, they copied that faithfully too. The irony was delicious, really. These copyists, many of whom were failed scholars themselves, spent their days rewriting the hopes and dreams of others. They saw every variety of scholarly success and failure, every type of brilliant insight and embarrassing mistake. In some ways, they became the most educated people in the empire about the quality of contemporary scholarship. Even though their own examination careers had ended unsuccessfully, the work was exhausting and precise. A copyist who made errors could invalidate an entire essay. If they miscopied a crucial character, changed the meaning of a sentence, or accidentally skipped a line, they might destroy a scholar's chances without anyone ever knowing. The pressure on these copyists was enormous. They held other people's futures in their hands with every brushstroke. The copying rooms must have been fascinating places. Dozens of scribes bent over their desks, working by lamplight, surrounded by towering stacks of original papers and growing piles of copies. The air would be thick with ink fumes and the concentrated silence of people doing detail-oriented work. Occasionally, you might hear a soft exclamation when a copyist encountered particularly beautiful calligraphy or especially profound insights. But the human element introduced its own complications. Copyists got tired. After hours of transcription, Their attention wandered. Sometimes they unconsciously corrected obvious errors in the original papers, making a scholar's work look better than it actually was. Other times, fatigue led them to introduce new mistakes that hadn't existed in the original. And then there were the copyists who, well, who perhaps felt sorry for scholars whose essays showed promise but contained minor errors. A character corrected here, a small grammatical improvement there. Acts of kindness that violated the system's rules but might change someone's entire life trajectory. Once copying was complete, the real evaluation began. Your essay, now in standardized handwriting, would pass through multiple rounds of review. Initial screeners would eliminate obviously inadequate papers, essays with fundamental errors, incomplete responses, or content that demonstrated complete misunderstanding of the questions. Papers that survived the initial screening faced more detailed evaluation. Senior graders would read them carefully, looking not just for correct information, but for original insights, elegant expression, proper citation of classical sources, and that indefinable quality of scholarly sophistication that separated truly excellent work from merely competent responses. The grading process could take weeks or months. Each paper might be read by multiple evaluators, with disagreements resolved through discussion or additional review. Some graders specialized in particular aspects. One might focus on literary style, another on philosophical depth, a third on practical policy recommendations. Your papers have been submitted. Now begins the waiting. And these days of uncertainty might feel longer than all the years of preparation that came before. You emerge from your examination cell, blinking in the daylight, physically and emotionally drained. Your hand aches from days of writing. Your back is stiff from hunching over that tiny writing surface. But your mind is a swirling mixture of relief, exhaustion, hope, and terror. Some scholars pack up immediately and begin the long journey home, unwilling to spend precious money waiting in the capital for results that might not come for months. Others remain, unable to bear the thought of being far away when their fate is decided. The city takes on a strange quality during these waiting periods, filled with anxious young men who drift aimlessly through streets and markets, too nervous to enjoy anything, too hopeful to despair completely. The conversations you overhear during this time are poignant. Scholars dissecting their examination performance, wondering if they correctly interpreted the questions, worrying about whether their calligraphy was acceptable, agonizing over word choices they made days ago, but can no longer change. Did you write about the agricultural policies of the Han Dynasty in your third essay? One might ask another. I spent 2 paragraphs on water management, but now I'm wondering if they wanted more focus on taxation. These post-examination discussions become a form of shared torture as scholars realize all the things they might have done differently. The rumor mill during waiting periods is extraordinary. Someone heard that this year's graders were particularly strict about calligraphy. Another person insists that essays emphasizing Confucian morality over practical governance scored higher. A third claims to know someone whose brother works in the examination bureau and says the grading is running behind schedule. Truth and speculation blend together until it becomes impossible to distinguish reliable information from wishful thinking or neurotic worry. Scholars develop elaborate theories about grading preferences, timing, even the personal habits of examination officials they've never met. Some scholars develop peculiar coping mechanisms during the waiting period. They might visit temples daily, making offerings and requesting divine intervention in the grading process. Others throw themselves into studying for the next examination cycle, as if staying busy could somehow influence results that have already been determined. A few try to enjoy themselves, exploring the capital, sampling local foods, visiting cultural sites. But anxiety has a way of contaminating even pleasant experiences. The financial pressure during waiting periods adds another layer of stress. Every day in the capital costs money: lodging, food, transportation. Families that have already invested heavily in examination preparation face difficult decisions: spend more money waiting for results, or return home and risk missing important announcements. Letters from home arrive sporadically, carrying family expectations and village hopes. The entire clan is praying for your success. Your mother lights incense every morning. The neighbor's son failed his examination last year, but we know you'll do better. Each letter increases the weight of responsibility, the fear of disappointing people who have sacrificed for your education. Sleep becomes elusive during waiting periods. Scholars lie awake replaying their examination performance, imagining best case and worst case scenarios, calculating and recalculating their chances of success. Some develop elaborate mental rituals. If I see 3 red birds tomorrow, it means I passed. If it rains before noon, my results will be good. Magical thinking that provides temporary comfort, but no real relief. Dreams during this period are often vivid and examination related. Scholars dream of seeing their names on success lists, of receiving official appointments, of returning home in triumph. But they also have nightmares about discovering errors in their essays, about examination papers that mysteriously disappear, about waiting forever for results that never come. The waiting affects different people in different ways. Some become philosophical, accepting that their fate is now beyond their control. Others become obsessive, haunting the examination buildings, hoping for early news, befriending low-level officials who might have access to information. A few become depressed, unable to function normally while their future hangs in the balance. And then, finally, that day arrives. The day when the results are posted publicly, when thousands of young men learn whether their dreams have come true or been shattered. Picture the scene: a massive crowd gathering before dawn at the announcement site. Thousands of scholars, plus family members who made the journey to the capital, plus curious onlookers who come to witness the drama. The energy is electric: nervous laughter, whispered prayers, the sound of thousands of people trying to control their breathing. The announcement board itself is enormous, large enough to display hundreds of names and characters big enough to be read from a distance. But even with large characters, the crowd pressing forward creates a chaotic scramble. People climb on each other's shoulders, push through the masses, crane their necks desperately trying to see. When the board is finally unveiled, the moment of absolute truth, the crowd's reaction is unlike anything else in human experience. It's a symphony of pure emotion. Screams of joy from those who find their names, wails of despair from those who don't, stunned silence from people trying to process what they're seeing. Some scholars find their names immediately and burst into tears of relief and happiness. Others search frantically, checking and rechecking, hoping they missed their name the first time through. The lucky ones are surrounded immediately by well-wishers, lifted onto shoulders, celebrated like conquering heroes. But perhaps more touching are the quiet reactions. The scholar who finds his name and simply stands there, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. The young man who searches the list 3 times before accepting that his name isn't there, then walks away with dignity intact, but dreams crumbling. The family member who traveled hundreds of miles just to share this moment, regardless of the outcome. Success brings immediate transformation. Scholars who pass the examinations are no longer just young men with academic potential. They become eligible for government positions, respected members of society, sources of family pride. Marriage prospects improve dramatically. Financial worries diminish. Social status changes overnight. The celebrations for successful scholars are elaborate affairs. Families organize banquets. Communities hold parades. Friends compose congratulatory poems. Some successful scholars are so overwhelmed by the sudden attention that they need time to adjust to their new circumstances. The contrast between examination cell isolation and public celebration can be jarring. But failure brings its own form of transformation. Some unsuccessful scholars accept their results with grace, returning home to pursue other paths: teaching, commerce, local administration. They've gained valuable education and experience, even without official success. Others are devastated by failure. Years of preparation, family sacrifice, personal dreams, all apparently wasted. Some fall into deep depression. A few never fully recover from the disappointment. The psychological impact of examination failure could last for years, affecting not just the unsuccessful scholar, but their entire family. Yet there are also inspiring stories of persistence. Scholars who fail repeatedly, but continue attempting the examinations, driven by unshakable belief in their abilities and dreams. Some eventually succeed after multiple attempts, bringing even greater satisfaction because of the obstacles they overcame. History records some fascinating cases. The scholar who passed on his 15th attempt at age 65, the young man who failed but whose examination essays were so impressive that he was offered a teaching position anyway. The candidate who was initially listed as failed due to a clerical error, but whose name was corrected weeks later. The announcement day also reveals the arbitrary nature of examination success. Sometimes, brilliant scholars fail due to minor technical errors, while mediocre students succeed because their essays happen to align with greater preferences. The system, despite all its elaborate fairness procedures, still contained elements of chance and subjectivity. As the crowds disperse and the initial emotions settle, successful and unsuccessful scholars alike face the same question: what happens next? For those who passed, new challenges await: navigating government bureaucracy, proving themselves worthy of their success, living up to the expectations their achievement creates. For those who failed, well, they face different but equally challenging decisions. Do they attempt the examinations again? Pursue alternative careers? Accept that their dreams of scholarly success may never be realized? The examination results, whether success or failure, mark not an ending, but a transition. The years of preparation, The journey to the capital, the days of testing, the weeks of waiting. All of this becomes part of these young men's stories, shaping who they become, regardless of whether their names appeared on that final list. And yet, there are more stories hidden within this system. Tales of ingenuity and deception, of unexpected successes and surprising failures, of the ways people adapted and subverted and occasionally transcended the rules that governed their lives. Tomorrow, we'll explore some of these hidden corners, the creative approaches to rule bending, the occasional remarkable individuals who challenged the system's assumptions, and perhaps most surprisingly, how these ancient examination procedures compare to our modern testing experiences. But for now, let's simply imagine those thousands of young scholars, each carrying their own mixture of triumph and disappointment, hope and exhaustion as they begin the next chapters of their lives. Chapter 4, Fascinating Hidden Corners and the Modernization of Imperial Examinations. No matter how strict the regulations became, human ingenuity in circumventing rules proved to be, well, quite boundless. The creativity displayed in academic dishonesty was, in its own way, rather impressive. Scholars developed techniques that would make modern cheaters seem amateur by comparison. They created what could only be described as armor made of text, specially tailored undergarments with thousands of tiny characters embroidered on the inside fabric, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Some ingenious students mastered the art of microscopic writing. Using brushes with tips sharpened to needle points, they would write entire essays in characters so small they required magnifying glasses to read. These miniature masterpieces would then be hidden in the most creative locations. Inside the hollow cores of writing brushes, carved into the wooden handles of tools, even written on the inside surfaces of shoe soles, with special inks that became visible only when warmed by body heat. The substitute scholar technique was perhaps the most audacious form of cheating. Brilliant students would essentially rent out their scholarly abilities, taking examinations on behalf of less gifted but more wealthy candidates. This required elaborate identity fraud, false documents, physical disguises, sometimes even coaching the real candidate's family members so they could maintain the deception if questioned. The level of organization required for some cheating schemes was extraordinary. Networks of scholars, corrupt officials, and entrepreneurial middlemen would coordinate complex operations spanning multiple provinces. They developed their own systems of codes, secret signals, and document forgeries that rivaled anything produced by government bureaucracies. One particularly sophisticated method involved pre-positioning accomplices near examination compounds. These helpers would use various signals, flags, mirrors reflecting sunlight, even trained birds, to communicate information to test takers. Some examination halls responded by building higher walls and posting guards specifically to watch for external communication attempts. The examination authorities, of course, evolved their own countermeasures. Special detection techniques, surprise inspections, elaborate monitoring systems. It became an arms race between rule makers and rule breakers, each side developing increasingly sophisticated methods. Guards were trained to recognize the signs of hidden materials, to detect unusual behavior patterns, to spot the subtle differences between genuine and forged documents. When cheating was discovered, the consequences were substantial. Public humiliation was often part of the punishment. Offenders might be paraded through the streets, wearing signs describing their crimes, their names posted publicly as warnings to others. Some were banned from taking examinations for years, effectively ending their scholarly careers before they truly began. Yet what's perhaps most fascinating is that these elaborate cheating schemes often required more intelligence, creativity, and dedication than simply studying for the examinations honestly. The mental energy devoted to circumventing the system could have been channeled into mastering the classical texts. But perhaps there's something fundamentally human about the desire to find shortcuts, to beat the system, to prove that cleverness can triumph over conventional rules. The most successful cheaters were often genuinely brilliant individuals who simply chose to apply their talents differently. Some later became respected officials, their early academic dishonesty forgotten or forgiven in light of their subsequent achievements. Others were caught and disgraced, their cleverness ultimately working against them. In the end, the elaborate cat-and-mouse game between cheaters and examination authorities reveals something charming about human nature. Despite facing a system designed to test their knowledge and character, some scholars couldn't resist the challenge of outwitting that very system. It's almost endearing in its own way. Now let's talk about one of the most, shall we say, unconventional aspects of the examination system. Officially, women were completely prohibited from participating in imperial examinations, but history, as it often does, contains some rather fascinating exceptions to this rule. The vast majority of the time, examination halls were exclusively male spaces. Women, regardless of their intelligence or education, were expected to focus on domestic responsibilities rather than scholarly pursuits. But occasionally, very occasionally, determined women found ways to challenge these restrictions. The stories that survive, and we must remember, these might be part legend, part historical fact, tell of women who disguised themselves as men to take examinations. This required extraordinary courage and planning. They had to master not just academic material, but masculine mannerisms, speech patterns, even the way men walked and gestured. Consider the logistical challenges. These women had to maintain their disguises for weeks or months during the journey to examination sites, throughout the testing period, and while waiting for results. They needed to interact convincingly with other scholars, guards, officials, all while concealing their true identities in a society where discovery would bring severe consequences. The physical aspects of the deception were particularly challenging, binding their bodies to create masculine silhouettes, cutting their hair in male styles, developing calluses on their hands to match those of young men who had spent years writing. Some stories describe women practicing masculine behaviors for months before attempting their deceptions. The most famous of these tales, though it blends history with romance, is the story of Zhu Yingtai, who disguised herself to attend school alongside Liang Shanbo. While their story is remembered primarily as a tragic love tale, it also represents the lengths some women went to access education denied to them by society. But there were likely real cases too. Women whose intelligence and determination overcame seemingly impossible barriers. Some may have succeeded completely, living their entire adult lives as male scholars and officials. Others were perhaps discovered, but their stories suppressed to avoid encouraging similar attempts. Imagine the psychological pressure these women faced. Not only did they endure the same academic stress as male scholars, but they carried the additional burden of maintaining a false identity under intense scrutiny. Every interaction was potentially dangerous, every moment requiring careful performance of masculinity. The few historical accounts that survive suggest these women often possessed exceptional intelligence, not just academic brilliance, but the social intelligence required to navigate complex deceptions. They had to understand male behavior well enough to imitate it convincingly, while also mastering scholarly materials that most men found challenging. What's perhaps most remarkable is that some of these women may have succeeded so completely that their true identities were never discovered. There might be historical figures we remember as male scholars who were actually women in disguise. The ultimate success of their deceptions means we'll never know their true stories. The examination system's gender restrictions reflected broader social attitudes, but they also created situations where exceptional individuals were forced to choose between accepting limitations or taking extraordinary risks. Some chose the risks, and in doing so, created fascinating chapters in the hidden history of women's education. The examination system shaped Chinese society in ways that extended far beyond education and government service. It became a cultural phenomenon that influenced literature, art, family structure, even the physical design of cities and towns. Think about it. When an entire society organizes itself around the idea that scholarly achievement represents the highest form of success, everything begins to reflect that value. Families plan their finances around supporting potential scholars. Communities took pride in producing examination success stories. Even architecture adapted. Libraries, study halls, and examination preparation facilities became prominent features of Chinese cities. The literature of the period is filled with examination themes. Poets wrote about the loneliness of scholarly preparation, the anxiety of waiting for results, the joy of success, and the melancholy of failure. These weren't just academic exercises. They were deeply personal expressions of experiences that touched virtually every family in Chinese society. Popular stories and novels featured scholars as heroes, romantic figures whose intelligence and dedication made them worthy of admiration and love. The image of the poor but brilliant student, studying by candlelight in humble circumstances, became a powerful cultural archetype. This idealization of scholarly poverty, the notion that true learning required sacrifice and dedication, influenced how society viewed both education and material success. Marriage customs adapted to the examination system as well. Families with scholarly sons became attractive alliance partners, even if they were currently poor. The potential for future success through examinations made young scholars desirable marriage prospects. Some families would essentially invest in promising students, supporting their education in hopes of eventually benefiting from their success. Villages and towns developed their own mini-cultures around examination preparation. Local teachers became important community figures. Successful examination candidates were celebrated as local heroes, their achievements bringing honor to their entire communities. Some places became known for producing scholars, creating reputations that attracted students from other regions. The economic impact was substantial too. Entire industries developed around examination preparation. Bookshops specializing in classical texts, calligraphy teachers, even specialists who taught examination-specific skills like essay structure and time management. The movement of thousands of scholars to examination sites created temporary markets. Lodging, food, transportation, all focused around examination schedules. But perhaps most significantly, the examination system created a unique social class, the scholar bureaucrats who formed the backbone of Chinese governance for centuries. These weren't hereditary nobles or military leaders, but individuals who had proven their intellectual abilities through competitive testing. This created a somewhat more merit-based society, though one still influenced by wealth and social connections. The psychological impact on Chinese culture was profound. The examination system encouraged certain values: persistence, respect for classical learning, acceptance of hierarchical authority, faith in the possibility of social mobility through education. These values became deeply embedded in Chinese society, influencing attitudes toward education, government, and personal achievement for centuries. At the same time, the system created its own problems. The intense focus on examination success sometimes discouraged practical innovation or creative thinking. Students learned to reproduce accepted interpretations of classical texts rather than developing original ideas. The system rewarded conformity and memorization over creativity and critical thinking. Listening to these stories, you might find yourself feeling, well, perhaps a bit more appreciative of modern testing procedures despite their imperfections. Today's students face plenty of pressure. Certainly, standardized tests, college admissions, competitive scholarships. But imagine if taking the SAT required months of travel on foot, carrying your own bed, and spending several days locked in a cell-like room with only a chamber pot for company. Suddenly, a 3-hour exam in an air-conditioned room with bathroom breaks seems almost luxurious. We complain about having to bring number 2 pencils and calculators to tests, but at least we don't have to worry about grinding our own ink or making sure our candles don't blow out mid-exam. The most complex preparation most students face is remembering to set an alarm clock, not planning a multi-month journey across dangerous terrain while carrying all their worldly possessions. Modern test anxiety is real and challenging, but it rarely involves fear of execution for accidental rule violations. Today's students don't have to memorize lists of prohibited names to avoid accidentally committing treason with their essays. The worst consequence for most contemporary test takers is having to retake an exam, not being banned from testing for life or facing public humiliation. The technology we take for granted would seem magical to ancient scholars. Printed books instead of hand-copied texts. Imagine having access to identical, accurate copies of reference materials instead of manuscripts that might contain copying errors from previous scribes. Electric lighting that never flickers or runs out. Heating and cooling systems that maintain comfortable temperatures regardless of weather. Even the basic logistics of modern testing are remarkably humane. Students can usually sleep in their own beds the night before exams, eat familiar food, wear comfortable clothing. They don't have to worry about bandits on the journey to test sites or whether their examination papers will be lost in bureaucratic processing. Perhaps most importantly, modern testing systems, for all their flaws, generally try to accommodate different learning styles and needs. Students with disabilities receive accommodations. Multiple testing dates provide flexibility. Score reporting is relatively quick and reliable. The entire process, while stressful, is designed with basic human dignity in mind. The examination system we've been exploring tonight was, in its time, actually quite progressive. The idea of merit-based selection was revolutionary in societies dominated by hereditary privilege. The attempts to ensure fairness through anonymous grading and elaborate security procedures showed genuine concern for equality, even if the execution was sometimes challenging. But the comparison helps us appreciate how far we've come in making education and testing more humane, more accessible, and more focused on actual learning, rather than endurance and rule following. Modern students still face pressure, but they're not risking their lives or their family's financial ruin on a single testing opportunity. There's something beautiful about the dedication of those ancient scholars, their willingness to sacrifice years of their lives pursuing knowledge and the chance to serve their society. But there's also something wonderful about living in an era where education is more widely available, where testing procedures consider human comfort and dignity, where failure in one exam doesn't necessarily end all future opportunities. The stories of imperial examinations remind us that the human desire for learning, for achievement, for social contribution is timeless. But they also help us appreciate the relative kindness of our modern systems, the ways contemporary education tries to nurture potential rather than simply test endurance. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient examination halls, perhaps you're feeling a bit drowsy, your mind filled with images of scholars bent over their tiny desks, copying their hopes onto paper by candlelight. These stories from long ago have their own rhythm, their own gentle sadness and persistent hope. Tomorrow, we'll wrap up our exploration with some final thoughts about what these ancient testing rituals can teach us about human nature, about the pursuit of dreams, and about the strange and wonderful ways societies organize themselves around the idea that knowledge and wisdom matter. But for now, just let these images drift through your mind. Thousands of young men walking ancient roads, carrying their beds and their dreams, all hoping that their brushstrokes might change their lives forever. Fee, conclusion, history's gentle sigh, and a lullaby for sweet dreams. So here we are, having wandered together through the peculiar world of ancient Chinese imperial examinations, a world filled with rules so detailed, so meticulously bizarre, that they make our modern testing anxieties seem almost quaint by comparison. We've discovered quite a few unexpected things, haven't we? The portable bamboo beds that scholars carried for months across dangerous terrain. The tiny examination cells that were more like closets than classrooms. The elaborate rituals of body searches that checked even hair follicles for hidden notes. The terror of accidentally writing a forbidden name and facing, well, consequences that went far beyond a failing grade. We've learned about the creativity of cheaters who turned clothing into textbooks, who wrote essays in microscopic characters, who developed networks more sophisticated than some modern businesses. We've glimpsed the rare women who disguise themselves as men, risking everything for the chance to prove their intellectual worth in a world that officially denied them that opportunity. And perhaps most charmingly, we've seen how a society organized itself around the belief that knowledge and wisdom were well, worth almost any sacrifice. Families bankrupting themselves to support one scholar. Villages celebrating when a local boy succeeded. Entire industries developing around the movement of hopeful students to distant examination sites. All of this, the suffering and the dedication, the elaborate precautions and the creative circumventions, the dreams fulfilled and shattered. It paints a picture of human nature that's both wonderfully stubborn and oddly touching. People have always been willing to endure remarkable hardships in pursuit of their dreams, haven't they? What strikes me most about these ancient scholars isn't the strangeness of their world, but the familiarity of their hopes. Despite the bamboo beds, the chamber pots, the fear of imperial taboos, these were young people pursuing dreams that we recognize immediately. They wanted to matter. They wanted to use their talents in service of something larger than themselves. They believed that education could transform not just their own lives, but their family's circumstances, their community's futures. That fundamental faith in the power of learning, in the possibility of betterment through knowledge, it's rather timeless, isn't it? Think about the determination required, years of preparation, often in poverty, months of dangerous travel, carrying everything they owned, days of testing under conditions that would challenge anyone's physical and mental endurance, weeks of agonizing uncertainty, waiting for results that could change everything. And yet, they kept trying. Some scholars attempted these examinations multiple times over decades, never losing faith that this time might be different. That kind of persistence in the face of repeated disappointment requires a kind of courage that's both admirable and slightly heartbreaking. The system they navigated was often unfair, sometimes absurd, occasionally cruel. But within that imperfect framework, individuals found ways to express their humanity. They helped each other during the journey to examination sites. They shared food and comfort during waiting periods. They celebrated together when dreams came true and consoled each other when hopes were disappointed. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how they maintained their dignity and kindness despite a system designed to reduce them to numbers, to test scores, to pass or fail categorizations. They remained human. They continued to care for each other, to dream, to hope, to persist in believing that tomorrow might be better than today. These ancient scholars remind us that the desire to grow, to learn, to contribute something meaningful to the world, these aren't modern inventions. They're deep currents in human nature that flow beneath all the surface differences of technology and custom and historical circumstance. Their world was different from ours in countless ways, but their fundamental hopes were recognizable to anyone who's ever wanted to prove themselves worthy of their dreams, who's ever believed that knowledge and dedication might open doors to a better future. In our own time, we still have young people carrying hopes and fears to testing centers, though thankfully they no longer need to carry their beds. We still have families sacrificing to support educational dreams. We still have individuals whose lives are transformed by academic opportunities. The details have changed, but the essential human story continues now. As our journey through these ancient examination halls comes to an end, perhaps you can feel your mind beginning to settle. The way dust settles after a long journey. The way thoughts become quieter as the day fades into evening. Take a moment to appreciate the comfort of your present situation. You're not hunched over a tiny writing surface by candlelight, worried about ink freezing or papers blowing away in the wind. You're not wondering whether you accidentally wrote a forbidden name, or whether your examination papers will be lost in bureaucratic processing, or whether bandits might rob you on a dangerous journey home. Instead, you're here, comfortable, safe, with nothing more pressing to worry about than whether you'll sleep peacefully tonight. The scholars we've been following had to earn their rest through trials that tested every aspect of their endurance. But your rest tonight is freely given, a gift of the present moment. Let those images we've explored together drift through your consciousness now, not as sources of anxiety or excitement, but as gentle companions for your transition into sleep. Picture those thousands of oil lamps flickering in examination compounds centuries ago, each light representing someone's hopes, someone's dedication to something larger than themselves. Imagine the quiet scratching of brushes on paper, the soft sounds of scholarly concentration, the gentle rhythms of people pursuing their dreams despite difficult circumstances. There's something almost musical about it, isn't there? The steady persistence of human effort, the quiet faith that tomorrow might bring better news. Those ancient scholars faced their challenges with courage and hope. Tonight, you can face your own rest with the same gentle confidence. Whatever tomorrow brings, tonight is for peace. Tonight is for letting go of the day's concerns and allowing yourself the comfort of simple, undisturbed sleep. The stories we've shared have been full of journeys. Scholars traveling across vast distances, papers moving through bureaucratic processes, dreams traveling from hope to fulfillment or disappointment. But now, it's time for a different kind of journey. The gentle passage from wakefulness into sleep, from the busy thoughts of day into the quiet rest of night. You don't need to carry anything heavy with you into sleep tonight. No bamboo bed frame, no bags of books, no anxiety about examination results. Just let yourself sink into comfort, into the soft support of your bed, into the peaceful darkness that welcomes you without conditions or requirements. Those long ago scholars would envy you this moment, this freedom from worry, this luxury of rest without fear, the simple pleasure of ending a day with nothing more urgent than the prospect of pleasant dreams. They carried their burdens across centuries to bring us these stories, and now those stories can carry you gently into sleep. Let the ancient paths they walked become the pathways of your dreams, not the difficult, dangerous roads they actually traveled, but peaceful trails that lead to rest, to contentment, to the deep, quiet satisfaction of a mind that has wandered far and now returns home to itself. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle wisdom of those who came before us, who faced their challenges with courage and hope, and who remind us that rest, sweet, peaceful rest, is both earned and freely given. Good night,